This is the Nexus 5, and it's a decade old already. It's a milestone Google phone from late 2013, early 2014 that's fondly remembered by a lot of fans, including yours truly. So let's take a look back over this plastic pre-pixel powerhouse and also see what you can do with one of these if you still have one today. I'm Alex Dobie, this is XDA TV. Unlock your bootloaders, enable art in the developer options, and turn on HDR+, because it's time to revisit the LG Nexus 5 10 years on. So if I was going to sum up the Nexus 5 in one thesis sentence, I'd say this was the Nexus phone for the people. It was the pinnacle of Google's efforts to turn the Nexus brand, something which up until then had really been this weird niche thing for nerds and developers, into something with mass market appeal. The starting point, of course, was the price. After the really unexpected success of the Nexus 4, also made by LG, the 5 debuted at $349 US. Adjusted for inflation, that's around $460 in 2023 dollars. Or to put it another way, a real tip-top flagship phone for Pixel A series money. It had the leading Snapdragon 800 chip, a roomy 2GB of RAM, and an acceptable 16GB of storage in the base model. You could shell out an additional Ulysses S Grant if you wanted for the 32GB variant with more space. Whichever one you picked up though, it'd come with 4G LTE connectivity, the lack of which was a big pain point for the Nexus 4 in some countries. And Qi wireless charging in 2013, how about that? Still got good old micro USB down here for wide charging for what that's worth. Point is, the Nexus 5 outspec'd and outperformed many devices that were selling for almost double its starting price. Flagships from HTC and Samsung, the Android leaders at the time, started at $600 to $700 if you bought them off contract. And as much as everyone likes to give OnePlus the credit for being the flagship killer with super aggressive specs and price, Google was just as competitive with the Nexus 4 and 5, and you could argue they actually got there first. That price inevitably meant some corners being cut though, and the easiest one to point to in the Nexus 5 is the construction. After flirting with more premium materials in the sparkly backed Nexus 4, the 5 went all in on plastic. This had some advantages. The polycarbonate shell makes the phone feel almost unnaturally light, especially compared to the clunky, hefty 5G phones of the mid-2020s. It's very easy to forget this is even in your pocket when you're carrying it around, but inevitably it also felt cheaper than the likes of the HTC One M7, which was turning heads in 2013 with its sharp aluminium body. Unlike the Nexus 4, which was clearly styled after manufacturer LG's Optimus G, the Nexus 5 was kind of its own thing design-wise. The specs closely matched the LG G2, but the design, complete with soft-touch plastic and bowed top and bottom frame, was a unique specimen. With a 5-inch 16:9 LCD display and typical for the time forehead and chin borders, the Nexus 5 comes in somewhere close to the smaller Pro iPhones of today. That is to say, it's small enough to be manageable, but with a large enough display to not feel cramped while streaming from Google Play Music, browsing Google+, and doing other 2013 smartphone things. The IPS LCD panel wasn't as vibrant as a lot of contemporary AMOLEDs, but the use of an IPS screen gave you an image that looked like it was attached right to the surface of the glass. We kind of take this for granted with phone displays today, but many early 2010s panels that used OLED or some earlier iteration of LCD had unsightly air gaps between the panel and the glass. Again, remember this thing cost $349 in 2013. For that price you might expect some corner cutting on the display, but no, this was a great panel. As for daylight visibility though, well, any phone of this era is going to be tough to use in direct sunlight, and the Nexus is no exception. So around back there's the big prominent Nexus branding that became a staple in later models like the 6 and 6P, punctuated by a rear camera, an 8-megapixel unit, that was typical for the time with optical image stabilization, which definitely was not. Now, the Nexus 5 camera became somewhat of a controversial topic among mid-2010s tech blogs. A lot of early reviews and hands-on coverage panned it, posting unflattering comparison shots versus the competition. But I'm here to tell you that actually everyone else in 2013 was wrong about this, and the Nexus 5 camera actually was in fact pretty good. So let me explain. The key to taking amazing, or at least acceptable, photos with this camera was a feature Google barely talked about at all at the time, HDR+. The Nexus 5 was the first phone to use HDR+, a multi-frame processing technology that started life on Google Glass a couple of years earlier. It's also known by its internal name, Gcam. In essence, HDR Plus aimed to tackle the problem of smartphone cameras taking rubbish photos because of their tiny image sensors by using computational photography, capturing as much data as possible across many exposures, then using the number crunching power of the smartphone processor to create a better looking photo out of all that data. If you know a little about later Google phones like the Nexus 6P and the early Pixels, then you'll know that HDR Plus was the single most important thing about those critically praised cameras. The Nexus 5 had a nascent version of this HDR Plus technology, but again, Google barely mentioned it, and it wasn't even enabled by default, so most people just shot in full auto without realizing any of the benefits of HDR Plus. But if you do enable it, the difference really is night and day, especially in challenging or darker lighting conditions, as you'll see here. It really was possible to take decent, okay, again acceptable looking photos on this $350 phone from 2013. Of course, there really is no contest when you take this early first generation iteration of HDR Plus running on the Nexus 5 and put it up against the HDR Plus of today running on Google's 2023 flagship, the Pixel 8 Pro. But as rough as these Nexus shots look alongside a phone from a decade later that costs almost 3 times as much, in some situations the difference when viewed on a phone screen at least isn't as much as you might think. Before we move on from the external hardware, it is worth pointing out one key detail that hasn't aged so well after 10 years, and that's the finish of pretty much every black Nexus 5 ever to have been manufactured. Yes, our old friend rubber Reversion is rearing its sticky head once again. Basically, the rubbery matte finish of a lot of electronics will start to degrade after a decade or so of use. We saw this last year in our look back at the Nexus 4, which used a rubbery frame area around its glass back, but with the Nexus 5 the matte finish of the entire body will have reverted after 10 years of exposure to the air. That's why if you look at pretty much any Nexus 5 on sites like eBay, they look like this, pretty gross. My original black Nexus 5 has long since been liquidated, but I did pick up this almost pristine white model that doesn't suffer from quite the same level of reversion because it has a glossier finish. It's a bit slippier in the hand, but doesn't pick up as much pocket lint as I remember the black model doing a decade ago. And obviously it hasn't basically started to decompose like a lot of the black ones have from that period, so there's that. There is also a red Nexus 5 variant that launched a few months later than the other colours, which has a similar finish to the white and comes in a particularly eye-searing, migraine-inducing shade of the colour, accurately named bright red. So we touched on the internal hardware earlier with a spec sheet led by Qualcomm's excellent Snapdragon 800 chipset, but I want to underscore just how fast this phone felt, in part thanks to that chip of course, but also the maturity of vanilla Android of that era. The phone arrived running Android KitKat, with version 4.4 of the OS being the first and only to be co-branded in a partnership with snack giant Nestle. KitKat took the bones of earlier Android 4 releases and stripped out a lot of the sci-fi aesthetic and light blue hues in favour of brighter whites and a cleaner colour palette, plus more magazine-style UI influences. And it was pretty easy on the eyes, especially compared to a lot of Android manufacturer skins that were around back then. KitKat served as an off-ramp from this older, hollow design language and led into material design with the upgrade to Android 5.0 Lollipop in 2014. That summer, the Nexus 5 hosted the very first pre-release Android developer preview. That program obviously is still going strong today. And it's funny to look at this Android L preview from mid-2014 and see this weird prototype version of material design with its giant buttons and digital paper surfaces, as Google's designers were clearly still trying to figure out the material look and feel. The Nexus 5 would eventually be put out to pasture on Android 6.0.1 Marshmallow in late 2015 after receiving its promised 2 years of platform updates. It'd get official security updates for another year though, taking it through to the end of 2016, not too bad by the standards of Android back then. But that still strikes me as a shockingly short lifespan for this impressive little piece of kit, and it's because of that untapped power and, I guess, wasted potential that I thought I'd try putting something a bit more recent onto this Nexus 5. I've tried this on older models and it mostly hasn't gone too well. Modern Android has just been too weighty to run on the earlier models that I've attempted to bring back to life with custom ROMs like the Galaxy S3 and Nexus 4. But the Nexus 5 has a build of Android 13 available for it thanks to Lineage OS 20, the successor to good old CyanogenMod and XDA member Z3DD3R. The process of getting this ROM onto my Nexus 5 involved first unlocking the bootloader, easy because this is a Nexus after all, then flashing a custom recovery. From there I needed to repartition the Nexus's 16 gigs of internal storage to allow more of that space to be taken up by the OS. Then finally flashing the Lineage OS ROM itself and a very basic set of Google service components. And I was surprised by just how well Android 13 managed to run on this ancient 32-bit lightweight phone. It's definitely slower than it was on Android 6, especially with all the Google Mobile Services apps doing their thing in the background, but Lineage OS serves its purpose as a basic smartphone OS, bringing the Nexus 5 up to date with a current Android version that'll serve you pretty well for basic smartphone tasks. The UI performs pretty much fine. Multitasking is a little rough, understandably, on the 2 GB of RAM on offer here, so you'll need to be careful about what you install and maybe consider using it without Google services if you want a really decent level of performance. Ultimately though, this phone's expiry date is likely to be set by its 32-bit processor, as Google gradually retires support for 32-bit apps on the Play Store in the years ahead. For now though, it is an impressive technical feat to see Android from 2023 running on this hardware from 2013, so kudos to the developer. I personally have a lot of fond memories of using this thing back in its heyday. It was a cheap, supremely quick, high-quality phone that gave you the best Android software experience of the time, with conveniences like wireless charging and a peek at the future thanks to its early HDR+ camera capabilities. Not so great? Well, the battery life was pretty terrible back then owing to the small 2300 mAh battery. I remember taking this to Las Vegas for the CES show in 2014 and barely getting through my overpriced hotel breakfast by the time the Nexus 5 hit the 50% battery mark. 4G was rough on this phone's battery, and it's poor battery performance that probably burned me the most on this Nexus, leading me to abandon it in favor of HTC's impressive One M8 later that year. Sales figures for the Nexus 5 were never publicly disclosed by Google, though the company's CFO at the time called it a strong performer, and that's backed up by it being one of the more visible Android phones that you'd see here in Europe. In fact, I probably saw more Nexus 5s out in the wild than any other LG or Google handset back in the day. And that's because I think it was ultimately the only great affordable Nexus phone. The gigantic Nexus 6, basically a blown-up Motorola Moto X, debuted in late 2014 with a similarly inflated price tag. And the Nexus 5X was meant to be the spiritual successor to the 5 in 2015, but missed the mark with lackluster performance compared to the higher spec Nexus 6P. So this ended up being a one-of-a-kind phone, with a design and product strategy that was great while it lasted, but which didn't particularly stand the test of time. Instead, the likes of OnePlus were left to carry the mantle of the flagship killer at least for a few more generations. That said, thanks to custom ROMs, if you still have one today, there actually is some use for the Nexus 5 going into 2024. If you still have one knocking around, a rubber reversion notwithstanding. Be sure to share your memories of the Nexus 5 below and let me know which vintage phone you want to see revisited next. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.